At 11:47 on a Tuesday night in November, the lights inside Hargrove General Hospital did not simply go out. They stepped down in sequence, one section at a time, the way a building inhales before it stops breathing entirely. The emergency generators caught the first drop, as they were designed to, and for 9 seconds the ward corridors held their amber backup glow, and the nurses at the central station kept moving, and the monitors kept their green pulses, and everything seemed, as it sometimes does in the moment before a real crisis, as though the worst had already passed. Then the network died, not the power, the network. The distinction would take 20 minutes to fully understand and nearly cost 3 lives in the process. The electronic door system at Hargrove General had been installed 4 years earlier as part of a $5 million modernization program. Every patient access door on every floor, every medication room, every surgical prep corridor, every fire barrier and isolation chamber, and emergency stairwell door operated on a central server authenticated by a biometric credential system that was, as the contractor had assured the administration during the installation presentation, hardened against virtually any foreseeable disruption. The system had a dedicated fiber connection, a backup cellular relay, and an uninterruptible power supply rated for 72 hours. It was, by any reasonable modern assessment, redundant. What the system did not have was a manual override capable of functioning without a network signal. The designers had considered a manual override an unnecessary complication. The backup power ensured the digital system would remain operable. The network redundancy ensured the credential servers would remain reachable. Both assumptions turned out to be precisely wrong at precisely the same moment. The cyber attack had been building inside the hospital network for 11 days. It was patient in a way that automated intrusions rarely are, methodical in its approach to the credential management layer, quiet enough that the hospital information technology team, who monitored the system on a rotating shift, had flagged an anomaly twice and dismissed it twice as routine administrative traffic. The attacker had targeted the authentication server specifically, not to destroy it immediately, but to corrupt its verification pathway, so that at a chosen moment, every electronic door panel in the building would query the server, receive an invalid response, and default to its fail secure state. Fail secure meant locked. Every door in Hargrove General locked at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in November. And the building discovered in the minutes that followed exactly how completely it had trusted a system it had never tested under the conditions it was now facing. Anton Briggs heard the difference before he understood it. He was in the basement level, in the maintenance corridor that ran beneath the east wing, doing the last checks of his shift. He had worked at Hargrove General for 31 years. He had been offered the supervisor position twice and declined twice, not from lack of ability, but from a quiet conviction that the work he valued most was the kind done with his hands rather than his signature. His colleagues considered him reliable in the specific way that people become reliable when they have outlasted everyone who once doubted them. The young technicians who had joined in the last 5 years knew him primarily as the man who could find any valve in any basement corridor in the dark. He knew the building the way certain people know old music, not from notes on a page, but from memory in the body, from having moved through it so many times that its layout had become instinctual. He knew which corridor ran 8 degrees cooler than the others because of a ventilation asymmetry nobody had ever bothered to correct. He knew which stairwell door caught at the hinge on damp nights and required a shoulder push at exactly the right angle. He knew the sound the main elevator made when its cable tension was slightly off, a sound that had been present since the summer of 2011 and had never once produced a failure but had never quite gone away either. What he heard at 11:47 was silence where there had been mechanism. The door panels made a sound when they operated. Not a loud sound, not a sound most people would consciously register, but a low background frequency of servo motors and magnetic catches and ventilation fans in the panel housing that Anton had been listening to for 4 years, ever since the new system went in, without ever naming it. It was simply part of what the building sounded like, the way traffic is part of what a city sounds like, noticed only in its absence. When the network died, the panels went silent. Anton stopped in the corridor and stood very still. He looked at the panel on the east maintenance corridor door. The light that was normally a steady green was now a pulsing amber. He walked to it and pressed his badge against the reader. Nothing. He pressed his palm to the biometric plate. Nothing. He tried the handle. The door held firm. He had a ring of keys on his belt. He had carried the same ring of keys for 26 years. Several of them opened things that the modern key card system had technically replaced. He kept them because the building had not asked him for them back, and because in 31 years of maintenance work, he had developed an extremely low tolerance for situations where the answer to a problem existed on a ring in his pocket and was not used. He tried the oldest key on the ring. The lock cylinder, still present beneath the electronic panel housing, turned. He pushed through the door and moved toward the stairwell. He needed to understand what he was dealing with before he could be useful. He moved through the basement the way he always moved through it. Quickly, without hesitation, with the particular economy of a person who has memorized a space so thoroughly that darkness does not significantly slow them. At the central maintenance office on the basement level, he found Marcus Webb, 29 years old, 8 months into his first hospital maintenance position, sitting in front of a monitor that was showing him an error code he had never seen before. Marcus had the expression of a man who had been trained on a system that was currently refusing to behave like itself and was working through the possibility that he had somehow caused it. Anton looked at the screen. He looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. Then he picked up the desk phone. The desk phone was a wired line. It worked. He called the third-floor nurse's station on a direct extension he had memorized in 2006. A charge nurse named Patricia Voss answered on the second ring. He said, "I need you to tell me which doors you cannot open right now," and he listened carefully to her answer. What Patricia told him in the next 90 seconds confirmed what he already suspected but needed to hear from a clinical voice rather than a panel readout. 6 patient rooms on the third-floor cardiac unit were locked and inaccessible. The medication room on the same floor was sealed. 2 of the 4 emergency stairwell doors on the east side of the building had failed to their locked position, and the surgical supply corridor connecting the main building to the east annex, the corridor through which the overnight emergency surgical team moved when a trauma case arrived from the emergency department, was completely blocked. The surgical supply corridor was the problem that could not wait. There was a patient on the way. Patricia did not have all the details. The emergency department had radioed up before the network died. A 64-year-old man, cardiac event, transferred from a smaller facility 40 minutes away. He would arrive within the next 20 minutes, and the surgical team would need the supply corridor to reach the equipment they needed. Anton said, "I will have that corridor open." He said it in the same tone he used for every maintenance problem he had encountered in 31 years, the tone of a person who does not find the useful dramatic. Marcus looked at him. He said, "The corridor door runs on the main credential server. The whole east side is on the same circuit. There is no manual release that the installation team documented." Anton was already moving toward the door of the maintenance office. He said over his shoulder they did not document all of it. The East Wing of Hargrove General had not always been called the East Wing. Before 1989, it had been the Ashworth Building, a separate structure connected to the main hospital by a covered walkway. The covered walkway had been demolished and replaced with the surgical supply corridor in 1992. Before that demolition and reconstruction, however, the Ashworth Building and the main hospital had been connected by a different route entirely. The tunnel was not a secret. It was simply forgotten. It had been constructed in 1961 during an expansion project, a below-grade passage running from the main hospital basement to the Ashworth Building basement, designed to allow the movement of equipment, supplies, and occasionally patients during winter months without exposing anyone to weather. It was 112 feet long, concrete construction, with a mechanical ventilation system and 6 low-voltage light fixtures. It had been used continuously until 1992, when the surgical supply corridor above made it redundant. After that, it appeared in no current maintenance document because no current maintenance document referred to the Ashworth Building by its original name, or acknowledged the existence of a structure that had, to the modern institutional memory, simply become the East Wing. Anton had worked at the hospital in 1992. He had helped seal the tunnel himself. He had kept the key on his ring because nobody had asked for it, and because, as he had once explained to a younger colleague who found the habit puzzling, a sealed door is not the same as a solved problem. He was 63 years old. He had not been in the tunnel in 32 years. But he knew where the entrance was, the same way he knew where every valve was, from a memory built through presence and attention, and the conviction that a building contains more than what its most recent renovation chose to include. He moved through the basement at a pace Marcus was struggling to match. The younger man had grabbed a flashlight and his tool bag and was following without entirely understanding where they were going. Anton appreciated that. He did not have time to explain everything. and he had learned that people who asked fewer questions in a crisis were often the most useful ones in it. He stopped at a section of the basement wall that appeared, from any reasonable examination, to be a storage recess. Metal shelving units held cleaning supply cases. A fire extinguisher was mounted to the left. The floor in front of it was marked with a faded yellow safety stripe that years of foot traffic had reduced to a suggestion. He moved the nearest shelving unit to the left. It moved on casters that he had kept lubricated. Behind it was a door. Not a modern door. An original hospital construction door from 1961, painted over so many times that the hinges had become decorative elements in the paint surface, the keyhole filled with the compressed residue of 3 decades of disuse. The door frame held its shape. The concrete around it was solid. He found the key on his ring from memory. Third from the end, the one with the square head and the number 8 stamped into the bow. He had tested it in the lock every 5 years. Not because he expected to need it, but because a key that does not turn when needed is not a key at all. It turned. The door opened inward slowly, with a resistance that was the product of 4 coats of paint around the frame edge, and 32 years of atmospheric pressure differential, more than any structural problem. Anton pushed it through and held his flashlight up. The tunnel was exactly as he had left it in 1992. The concrete walls were dry. The floor was clean of standing water. 2 of the 6 light fixtures showed a faint reflection of his flashlight beam off their glass covers, suggesting the wiring might still be intact on the original circuit, which ran off a separate basement electrical panel. He found the panel switch 3 steps inside the entrance. He threw it. 3 of the 6 fixtures came on. The remaining 3 had dead bulbs. The working 3 were enough. He said to Marcus, "Go back to the maintenance office and call Patricia Voss again. Tell her to have someone at the Ashworth basement door, the door marked with a red cross and the words emergency equipment storage. Tell them it will open from this side in approximately 4 minutes." Marcus did not ask how he knew about the door on the other side. He had stopped asking questions 11 minutes ago and was beginning to understand why that was the correct approach. Anton walked the tunnel at a careful pace, checking the floor for any change in level or surface condition that might indicate water intrusion or structural settling. There was none he could detect. The ventilation ducts along the upper wall were silent, but the air was moving, a faint drift that suggested the mechanical system was still drawing through its original passive design even without the fans. The tunnel smelled of old concrete and a particular chemical compound he associated with specific years of his career. A cleaning agent the hospital had stopped using around 2003, somehow still present in the absorbed memory of the walls. He reached the far end in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The door on the Ashworth side had the same construction as the one he had entered. Same key, same resistance, same paint compression around the frame. It opened on the second application of force. He pushed through into the Ashworth basement equipment storage room and found 2 people already there. A surgical technician named Donna and the overnight facilities coordinator. A woman in her 40s named Ruth who had been called in specifically because she had been briefed on the lockdown situation and was trying to locate any functional exit from the East Annex. Ruth looked at Anton with the expression of someone who has been working a problem for 14 minutes and has just seen the problem solve itself from an unexpected direction. He said, "The tunnel is clear. It runs to the main basement. You have access to the main building." Ruth said, "How long has this been here?" He said, "Since 1961. She said, "Why is it not on any of our emergency maps?" He said, "Because the people who made the emergency maps did not ask the people who built the building." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she began directing the surgical technician through the tunnel toward the main building with the supply cart. The next 40 minutes operated in 2 simultaneous tracks. In one track, the information technology and facilities staff worked through the problem of the locked credentials system, which would eventually be resolved by physically resetting the authentication server from its uninterruptible power supply connection and forcing a complete reinitialization of the network pathway. This process took 63 minutes and required the physical presence of a contractor who lived 40 minutes from the hospital and drove through November rain to reach it. In the other track, Anton Briggs moved between the 2 buildings through a tunnel that had not been used since George H.W. Bush was president, carrying equipment, directing staff, and solving in practice a problem that the digital system had created in theory. The 64-year-old cardiac patient, whose name was Gerald Marsh, and who had driven himself to the smaller facility in Millbrook with a tightness in his chest that he had been ignoring for 4 hours, arrived at Hargrove General at 12:16 in the morning. The surgical team was ready. The supply corridor above remained locked. The equipment they needed had been moved through the tunnel 40 minutes earlier by a woman named Donna, pushing a cart over concrete poured during the Eisenhower administration. Gerald Marsh survived. He would not learn the full story of his arrival for 3 days, when Ruth told him in brief and factual terms why the maintenance worker who appeared at his recovery room door to check the ventilation unit was someone worth knowing. The network came back online at 1:51 in the morning. The electronic doors released with a collective mechanical click that traveled through the building floor by floor, a sound that the overnight staff registered with a collective exhale that nobody fully articulated but everyone felt. The Information Technology Security Team spent the following 4 days reconstructing the attack pathway. The intrusion had entered through a vendor management portal that used the same authentication server as the door system. The attacker had been inside the network for 11 days. The anomaly flags that had been dismissed as routine traffic were, in retrospect, exactly what the protocol said they were, but that the threshold for escalation had been set too high to trigger on the volume observed. The contractor who installed the door system was contacted. The question of whether a purely network-dependent fail-secure default constituted an acceptable design for a hospital setting was, after some initial defensiveness, acknowledged to be a question worth taking seriously. The tunnel appeared on an emergency access map for the first time in 32 years. Anton was asked to verify the map for accuracy. He did. He noted 3 additional below-grade passages that the current facility's documentation did not reflect and offered to walk any interested staff member through each of them. There was a meeting. Anton attended it at the request of the hospital administrator, a man named Dr. Elliot Crane, who was 51 years old and had run Hargrove General for 6 years, with a competence that was genuine and an institutional memory that was, as he was discovering, incomplete in ways he had not previously understood were possible. Dr. Crane asked Anton how long he had known about the tunnel. Anton said, 32 years, Doctor. Crane asked why he had kept the key after the tunnel was sealed. Anton was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had been in buildings long enough to understand that the decision to close something is not always the same as the decision that it will never be needed again. He said that an old passage and a key to it were not a burden. They were a form of insurance whose premium was the space on a key ring. Dr. Crane looked at him for a long. Then he said, I want you to walk me through every below-grade passage in this building that is not on our current map. Anton said that will take most of a morning. Dr. Crane said, I have the morning. They walked for 3 hours and 20 minutes. Anton named every corridor, every junction, every sealed door, every valve cluster, every original construction feature that had survived beneath the renovations and the certifications and the $5 million modernization programs that had come through the building in waves across 31 years. He explained which systems had been replaced in their visible portions and retained in their structural ones. He explained which emergency shutoffs operated mechanically regardless of network status and which had been converted to electronic control at some point in the past decade. He showed Dr. Crane a manual fire door release system in the original West Wing construction that no current staff member had been trained on because it predated the current training manual by 22 years. Dr. Crane did not speak for much of this. He asked occasional questions. He took notes. Near the end of the walk, in a basement junction room where 4 original construction corridors met beneath the main atrium, he stopped and looked at the hand-drawn maintenance diagram. Anton had pulled from a flat file cabinet, bolted to the wall, a diagram dated 1974, pencil lines on yellowed paper, with notations in the handwriting of a facilities engineer whose name appeared twice in the hospital's early records and nowhere in any current document. He said, how many other people know this building the way you do? Anton said, not many. He said it without complaint, simply as a fact of institutional change. The people who had known the building the way he did had retired or died or been replaced by staff whose training had been built entirely around the systems that currently existed, which was a reasonable approach if the systems could be trusted to keep existing, and a dangerous one when they could not. Dr. Crane said, I would like to change that. What changed was not dramatic. It was not a ceremony or a press release or a board resolution. It was a series of practical decisions made over the following months by people who had understood something they should have understood before. Anton was asked to lead a facilities orientation program for incoming maintenance staff, a program that included below-grade walkthroughs, mechanical override training, and the kind of institutional history that does not appear in any manual, because nobody thought to write it down while the people who knew it were still walking through the building every day. The orientation included the tunnel. Every maintenance hire who came through Hargrove General after March of the following year walked that 112 feet of 1961 concrete and understood what it meant. They understood not as historical decoration, but as practical knowledge. They understood that a building contains more than its current documentation, and that the difference between those two things is not trivia but safety margin. Anton trained 11 people in the first year. He drew a complete below-grade map of the original construction on actual paper with actual pencil, the same way the diagram from 1974 had been drawn, because he understood intuitively that a document which requires no power source to be read is a document that will be legible during the exact conditions under which it will most need to be read. The map was laminated and framed and hung in the main maintenance office beside the digital schematic. Patricia Voss, the charge nurse who had taken his call at 11:47 on the night the system failed, told the story at the annual facilities review the following autumn. She told it factually and with the professional restraint of a person who had been trained to present clinical information without embellishment. She said that the electronic system had failed. She said that the mechanical knowledge had not. She said that the patient who came through the door that night in November was alive because someone had kept a key for 32 years. And she said it in a tone that suggested the two facts were not separate observations, but one complete sentence. Anton was not in the room for the review. He had declined the invitation, not from false modesty, but from the genuine conviction that the morning would be better spent in the building than talking about it. He was in the East Wing basement at the time, replacing a gasket on one of the original pipe junction fittings that had been showing a slight weep for 2 weeks. He had the fitting apart in 8 minutes and the replacement seated and sealed in 14. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and added a line to his maintenance log in his own handwriting, fitting replaced, no further monitoring required, and moved on to the next item on his list. The tunnel door was propped open behind him. He had requested a formal installation of a pneumatic door stop the previous month, and the request had been approved without objection. Light came through from the basement corridor on the other side. The passage between the two buildings was no longer sealed. It was, finally and practically, part of the building again. He walked through it on his way back to the main building. He moved the same way he always moved through it, without hesitation, with a light step for a man his age, with the particular quality of attention that comes from having listened to a place for a very long time and knowing what it sounds like when it is well. The ventilation drew a steady cool current from east to west. The 3 working light fixtures cast their amber glow across the concrete. New box had been installed near the west entrance 6 weeks after the incident, housing a manual phone handset that connected to every nursing station in the hospital on a wired circuit that ran independently of the main network. It was not sophisticated. It was a box with a phone in it and a number list printed inside the lid in large, clear type. Anton had suggested the box. He had suggested the specific circuit route. He had pulled the wiring himself over a long weekend in January, running it through a conduit path that followed the tunnel wall and then branched into the main building through a case that dated to the original construction and had been unused since the 1980s. Nobody had told him to do it. He had simply looked at the tunnel and understood that restoring it as a passage was only half the value. A passage without communication was rescue. A passage with communication was system doctor. Crane had found him in the basement on the Sunday. He finished the wiring, had looked at the completed installation, and said only that it was well done. Anton had nodded and returned the compliment by finishing on time and leaving the workspace clean. The autumn after the incident, the hospital received a facilities inspection from the State Review Board. The inspection was thorough. The inspectors spent 2 days in the building. One of them, a woman who had been conducting hospital safety reviews for 20 years, asked to see the below-grade map during her visit to the maintenance office. She examined it for several minutes. She asked who had drawn it. The facilities coordinator pointed to Anton, who was at the coffee maker in the corner. The inspector walked over to him and said that in 20 years of inspections, she had not seen a hand-drawn below-grade map framed beside a digital schematic on a maintenance office wall. Anton said he had not seen a reason to choose between them. She said the combination suggested a facilities approach that treated institutional memory as a live document rather than an archive, and that she found this unusual and worth noting in her report. He said that he appreciated that. He poured his coffee and returned to his list. There is a quality that old institutions develop when they are healthy, a particular relationship between what is remembered and what is recorded, between the people who built the first version and the people who are running the current one, between the knowledge that lives in systems and the knowledge that lives in people. When that relationship is maintained, the institution can fail in one layer and survive because another layer held. When it is not maintained, the institution can look advanced and complete and fully operational right up until the moment that the one thing nobody remembered mattered more than everything everyone had upgraded. Hargrove General had nearly found that out the hard way. It had found it out instead through 112 feet of old concrete and a key that had stayed on a ring for 32 years without anyone having to explain why. Anton Briggs still worked the morning shift. He still carried the key ring. It was heavier now by 2 new additions, keys to the manual override boxes that had been installed in the East and West Annex stairwells as part of the post-incident facilities review. He did not think of the additional keys as awards or recognition. He thought of them as his responsibility expanding slightly, which was the same thing the ring had always been. He stopped at the tunnel entrance each morning when he passed it. Not for long, a second, sometimes 2. Just long enough to confirm the door was holding its position, the lights were functional, and the passage was clear. Some mornings in winter, with the hospital quiet above him and the amber light reaching down the tunnel corridor toward the East Annex, he stood there and thought about the night of November, and what had and had not happened, and what the distance between those 2 outcomes had actually been. 1 key, 1 door, 1 person who had understood that a sealed passage and a forgotten passage are not the same thing. That was the margin. Not a committee decision or a modernization budget or a redundancy protocol certified by a contractor. Just a key, and the knowledge of what it opened, and the quiet conviction that keeping it cost less than needing it and not having it. He never said this to anyone. He did not need to. The tunnel said it better than he could, and the tunnel said it every morning to every maintenance hire who walked through it during their orientation and learned, the way certain things can only be learned in person and in motion, that a hospital remembers what its people remember, and what its people forget, it cannot promise to survive. Gerald Marsh came back to the hospital 3 months later, not as a patient. He had recovered well and had been cleared for the kind of unhurried walking that constituted his current relationship with exercise. He came back because Ruth had called him to explain what had happened on the other side of his arrival. She was not sure it was standard protocol, but she had thought about it for a few weeks and decided that if she had been in his position, she would want to know. Gerald sat in the cafeteria and listened. He was a retired civil engineer who had spent 30 years on municipal infrastructure projects and had a particular appreciation for systems designed to outlast the assumptions of the people who built them. When Ruth finished, he sat for a moment looking at his key. He said, "In my field we call that load path redundancy. The idea that a structure should have more than one way to transfer force when the primary path fails. The ones that work longest are the ones where someone understood the load path so completely that they did not need to see it written down to know it was there." He looked out the cafeteria window at the East Annex, the building whose basement connected to the main hospital through 112 feet of concrete that had been sitting in the dark for 3 decades waiting to be useful again. He said the man who kept the key understood load path redundancy. He just called it something else. Ruth asked what he thought he called it. Gerald thought about it. He said, "I suspect he called it his job." The key ring stayed on Anton's belt. The tunnel stayed open. The map stayed on the wall beside the digital schematic, pencil lines on laminated paper, the handwriting of someone who had known the building from the ground up and had trusted that someone eventually would need to read what was written there. Progress had come through Hargrove General in waves across 6 decades, and the waves had left good things behind. Cleaner surfaces, faster systems, better tools, more capable monitoring and more precise intervention, and better outcomes for people who arrived in the night with something failing in their chest and needed the whole weight of a modern institution to turn in their direction quickly and without confusion. But beneath the progress in the concrete poured before any of the modern systems existed, the building held its original logic intact. It held the decisions made by engineers who had understood that a hospital is not a technology installation. It is a place where people come when the situation has exceeded what they can manage alone, and what they need from it is not efficiency in ordinary conditions, but reliability in extraordinary ones. The two are not the same requirement. Designing for one does not guarantee the other. The people who understood that distinction were the ones who built in the redundancy, the second path, the tunnel that ran below the corridor that ran above the place where the digital system had failed and locked the doors. Anton Briggs went home at the end of every shift to a house on a quiet street where he lived alone since his wife Margaret had died 4 years earlier. He had a daughter in Portland and a son in Cincinnati, and a garden that he maintained with the same methodical attention he brought to the hospital basement. He cooked his own meals, kept his own hours, and spent the late evenings reading the kind of technical literature that most people his age had set down. Mechanical engineering journals, infrastructure studies, case analyses from industrial accidents in which a failure to transfer institutional knowledge had been identified as a contributing factor. He read them not for professional development. He was 63 years old and had no plans to change professions or pursue additional credentials. He read them because they confirmed something he had been observing for 31 years and wanted to see reflected somewhere in formal language. The idea that the things most worth knowing about a built system are often the things least likely to appear in its current documentation, and that the cost of that gap is not abstract. It is paid in specific moments, at specific times, by specific people who needed the knowledge to be there and found it was not. He had found on the night of November that it was there. He had put it there himself in the 32 years of keeping a key that nobody had asked him to keep. That was not heroism, that was maintenance. The difference between a building that survives its own failures and one that does not is rarely a single dramatic act. It is more often the accumulated result of someone having decided, repeatedly, over a long period of time, that the work of remembering was worth doing even when nobody was watching. He turned off the light in the maintenance office at the end of his shift on a Tuesday evening in late February. 3 months after the night, the doors had locked and the tunnel had opened. The basement corridor was quiet. The panels on the doors showed their steady green. The network was up, and the credential server was responding. The system was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. He walked the east corridor toward the stairwell, passing the tunnel entrance. The door was propped open. The amber light reached down into the passage. The phone box on the west wall was closed and latent and waiting. He did not stop. He had already checked everything that needed checking that day. He moved through the building the way he always moved through it, without ceremony, without announcement, with the quiet confidence of a person who knows where they are and knows what it means to be there and has never once confused that knowledge with something that needed an audience. He took the stairs up to the main floor, badged through the exit, and walked out into the February evening where the cold was sharp and the parking lot lights made halos in the fog, and the hospital stood at his back with all its floors lit and all its systems running and all the people inside it, moving through their night with the particular trust that comes from being in a place that has promised, structurally and practically, and by the quiet labor of everyone who has ever kept anything working inside it, to hold.